and eats his own flesh. Well, he's not talking about the guy just chewing his body and so forth and eat his flesh. What he's basically talking about, here's a person, if I can't keep up with you, every time you get a new car, I can't get a new car, or every time you get a new house, I can't get a new house. So I just decide, every time you get a raise, I can't get a raise. So I just decide, says, man, away with that. I'm just going to quit working. I'm not going to do anything. That's what it means, folds his hands and eats his flesh. So we shouldn't be so envious of folks that we can't stand to see somebody else get ahead, that it frustrates us so much that they're getting ahead, in the term we use in a secular life, that we just decide, I'm just not going to do anything. You ever seen anybody like that? Have you ever been like that? Sometimes kids do. We have to stay behind kids that they don't imitate that sometimes in school. I've been trying to make this B. Every time I make a B, he makes an A. Well, I'm just not going to do anything. Now, can't do that. And especially if folks don't do that in living, or you check out. Solomon says in verse 6, he said, better is a handful with quietness than both hands full of travail and vexation of spirit. What's he saying? It's better to have a little bit and be at peace than to have a whole lot and be troubled. Most folks would agree with that. Honestly, everybody should agree with that. So, if I didn't have all these burdens, well, I could get more sleep. But Solomon says, better is a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. So we come to verse 7 is where we are today. I marked it in my book. Solomon said, then I returned, and I saw vanity under the sun. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 for those of you who just came in. He says, there is one alone. Anybody know what it's like to be alone? Be in the woods, get lost, be in your room, alone, or just alone. He said, but this person, if there's one alone, then he lists the obvious, there's not a second. Of course, if you're alone, you don't have anybody, there's not a second person. He said, yea, he has neither child, Solomon explains it. He doesn't have a child, he doesn't have a brother. Yet, there is no end of all his labor. Neither is his eyes satisfied with what? Riches. Neither does he say, man, what am I working for? I'm paraphrasing it for you so you can see it. I want you to see it. What am I working for? And bereave my soul of good. Solomon said this is also vanity and a sore travail. And now we know a lot of folks like this. Or if you don't, there are a lot of folks like this. You will know when I tell you there are a lot of folks like this. They don't have nothing to work for. Everybody needs to work because the book says if a man won't work, neither let him eat. They have nothing to work for, just work. Workaholics. Overtime and then sometime. Don't have a brother, sister, daughter, whatever the case it is. But just work. Wrapped up in work. Say, brother, sister, you got time to go to service? Says, I got to work. I know I'm meddling now. Y'all don't do that up here. They do that down south. I got to go to work. So, well, you always working. Yeah, but don't you make enough? Well, yeah, I do, but if I don't get it, somebody else will. Well, there's another side to that too. If you don't spend it, somebody else will too. If you don't believe it, just become deceased. And somebody else will. But Solomon says, he asks the question, who do I labor? What am I working for? A lot of us have made that statement. Why am I doing all this work? He said, I bereave my soul of good. Now, when he talks about the soul, it becomes super personal. It implies that whatever he's doing interferes with taking care of his or her soul. You remember that man back in Luke 12? Luke 12 was it Charles, right? Luke 12, where that man built he built those barns. He said, I know what I'm going to do. He said, he began to talk to himself. He said, soul, you have much good stored up for yourself. Now here's a man building stuff in barns and riches and so forth, and he talks to his soul. It would have been better if he just said talk to himself, but the Bible did not say he talked to himself. He talked to his soul. You got a lot of goods stored up. He said, but I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear these barns down. I'm going to build bigger barns. He said, I'm going to say, now he said I, but he did not say I'm going to say to myself. He said, I'm going to say to my soul, you have much goods. And as a phrase we use, eat and be merry. And God says to him, tonight, God said, you fool. Tonight your soul is required of you. And who's going to have all these things that you stored up? That's a reality. Whatever I store up, God never said anything wrong with storing. We had to have an emphasis on storing. You may store some things in your refrigerator because you know you need to eat the next week. But you don't go out and buy a year's supply, do you? At least I hope you don't. You tell somebody that's a secret about that. Now I confess, I have an object in my refrigerator that's been in there a year in the frozen box. I just never got around to eating it. That's all. Got to be cooked first or thrown out. But anyways, Solomon talks about work and bereaving your soul. When we take work to the point that it gets in the way of us taking care of our soul, then we're working too much. Yes, ma'am.
So I recently read a book about a hermit who lived in Maine. Hello. And I feel like this verse 8 applies to him as well. He lived by himself. He forsook his family. He had no relations with his family. He lived out in the woods for 20-some years and only spoke, well, I don't think, he might have spoken one word to one person in that 20 years. But he worked every day. His eye was not satisfied by riches. He didn't have riches. He didn't seek riches. It meant nothing to him. But all of the work he did, he wasn't doing it for anybody but himself. And there was no mention in the book of his faith. And all of that was for what?
NOTHING. You want to call it no thing or nothing?
Rich or poor?
Rich or poor. Rich or poor. So, but we still have people like that. I'm just going to go live to myself. I don't want to be around nobody else. I just wanted just to be me. Let me tell you something. Drop this on you while I'm flying. I might come across it in my notes somewhere else, but it's in my mind, so I'll drop it now. God never designed for you to live to yourself. Now, I didn't say live by yourself. Sometimes you don't have a choice. But I say he never designed for you to live to yourself. They said, brother, that's a strong statement you're making there. He gave Adam a wife, right? Now, everybody wasn't married that were Christians, but God gave the church. And in the church, he tells us that we are to be what? Comfort one another. We are to associate one another with one another. We are to fellowship with one another. You can't be a hermit and be in the church because you got to associate and fellowship with somebody. Amen, somebody. So, this person, and blame it all on work. And then here's the bad part. I know some folks don't like to hear this, but here's the bad part. You know, if you become a hermit, what happens when you get sick? You know, I taught a lesson a few weeks ago at a funeral, talk about seasons of life. What happens when you come to the winter part of your life and you get sick and you need somebody to take care of you, somebody to reach that walking cane and give it to you so you can get up? What happens when it becomes easier to sit down than it does to get up? What happens when arthritis and sciatic nerve and all those other kind of things begin to hit you and you need somebody to give you a glass of water or some food or something? What happens then? And you're a hermit. I'll tell you what happened. You just H-U-R-T. And how many times have we found folks who have passed along because, or died along because they just want to be hermit? And I read a sad story of a lady. She was 80-something years old. She says, well, all I ever did was just worked all my life, and I didn't really want to be around nobody much, so I just lived in the mountains. But when she lived in the mountains, so somebody had to go to the mountains after she got sick and bring her down so she could live somewhere else, and then other people had to take care of her. I never read all the story. I don't know what else happened to her life, but it's just something for us to think about. God never designed it that we should be alone. Notice what Solomon amplifies this point in verse 9. He said, 2 are better than 1. 2 are better than 1 because they have a what? Great reward for their labor. You know, there are people that throw things around and you know, they pick, and my phrase is they pick, P-I-C-K. They pick at folks, you know, who decide they want to work. Sometimes the wife works, the husband works. They go like, well, why are you both working? They say, well, we got some things we want to do. They're still in the springtime of their life, you know. We got some things we want to do. Why are you working? Well, first of all, they didn't know your business. All right? If it's not affecting their soul. But Solomon says, in such a case, 2 are better than 1. It's always better when 2 people can share time together than it is just one person just out there drinking a bottle of water by himself or herself, or trying to do a project by themselves. But Solomon says 2 are better than 1. Let's stay with Solomon here. He said 2 are better than 1 because they have a good, talk about work, a good reward for their what? For their labor. Several years ago, I was at a place, I won't call the city, and there was a guy in there that was adamant. He was a member of the church, of course, and he was adamant about families who had 2 people in the house working, namely husband and wife. He was just adamant about that. And so one day, somebody couldn't take it no more, and they pulled him aside and said, let me challenge you objectively. So you've been subjectively hard on this point for a long time. Let me challenge you objectively about your position here. So now, their children are in school, and the children are not being neglected. So the wife is working, and he works. And they both have made an agreement, and they both agree with what they both are doing. So why is that your business? Well, pretty soon, he had to take his battle somewhere else because he had been exposed with subjective thinking. I hope y'all know the difference. It's just my way or the highway, that type stuff. Anyways, Solomon says 2 are better than 1, for they have a labor for their reward. He said 4, if they fall, we know about this one, don't we? If they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falls, for he doesn't have anybody to help pick him up. Anybody know that feeling? Oh, man, you're glad to have somebody around when you fall. Several years ago, some brethren called me and said, we want you to come and preach for us. We're trying to get things established here with this new congregation and so forth. We want you to preach for this morning. And I was getting ready and so forth. And when I looked at my watch, I said, boy, I'm 2 minutes behind. I came downstairs and you know, every stairs got a step, right? I came downstairs and I missed the bottom step. And I kissed that floor. Now, my wife's already gone, deceased, so there was nobody to pick me up. So I laid there for a few minutes and I started praying. I said, Lord, I hope I'm not paralyzed. Please let me get up. So then when I found out I could roll over, I rolled over. And I didn't feel any pain in my neck. I said, okay, I guess I must be halfway okay. Then I rolled over and got on a knee. And I was already in my suit and tie and everything, got on a knee. Then I got up. I said, boy, I tell you what, boy, it'd be nice to have somebody. When you fall, it's always nice to have somebody around to pick you up. Amen, somebody. Yes, ma'am.
Briefly, when we're talking about one person living by themselves, it's not like you're describing, not always because they're a hermit. And you never know what that person is going through. And just like you, Robert, what you're saying is that you had fallen and no one was there to pick you up. So it's not by choice that some people are alone. Briefly, the little teeny story on Facebook had talked about this little granny that had called a cab to take her to the hospice place that she was getting ready to go into. Cab driver could see that all her furniture was covered, everything was going on like that. So he gets ready to take her to where she wants to go. And she says, oh, well, that's where I taught school. So they stopped in front of that place. He turned his meter off. He drove her around to where she had gone here to exercise. She'd gone here to a friend's house. And he took her around almost all night. And then he took her to the hospice place. And it just was like, what a lesson he thought for himself to do something for someone else like that.
Oh, great. Yeah, your point is well taken. I don't want to accent the point that something wrong with being alone. The point I want to accent is that, listen, it's always good when you have somebody else around. And if you fall, as Solomon mentions, right? If you fall, somebody can pick you up. But he said, woe unto him who falls, he doesn't have anybody to help him up. That's a terrible situation, especially if you eventually can't get up. All right? Thank you, Susan. He says, again in verse 11, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? Now, some people try to, twist that and make that like Solomon is advocating some sexual union and so forth. No, he's not. You want to read all about Solomon and his union for love and all that kind of read songs of Solomon. Solomon's just making a point. He's just making a point about the importance of two. And when I read that, I said, yeah, some people will take that and try to twist that one way, but don't try to read anything into that he's not talking about. Stay with the text. All right. He said, how can one be warm alone? He said in verse 12, if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. When I was in the Navy and we would get overseas and go on liberty, and that's when we leave the ship, for those of you who don't know what liberty is and so forth. You go out in town, they said, listen, you go out in town, you need a buddy system. Some of you probably remember that. You need a buddy system. Take somebody with you. And that was a reason for that, was so that if somebody out there tried to jump you, at least you had somebody to help ward them off. Well, one night I was stupid, but I was blessed, and I'll tell you about it. The last time in my life I ever got drunk. Oh yeah, I've been drunk before, not frequently, but I did get drunk. That was my birthday, and I decided one day in November I was going to go out there, and the guy said, "Man, come on, you need to stay with us." I said, "Man, no, I'm going in here and do this, and I'll do this." And when they found me later, I was lying in some alley by myself, and 3 or 4 guys had gathered around. Well, they were not my shipmates, but my shipmates saw them and they ran them off. They said, man, you crazy. That's the last time I ever got drunk in my life. That was umpteen years ago. But the point is this, and my mama used to tell us, don't go nowhere by yourself, because somebody want to jump on you, you always need some protection, need somebody to help you. But the point is this, Solomon says, if one prevail against him, two can withstand him. We used to do some stuff that was crazy when I grew up. One guy come across the fence and decided he wanted to jump on the brother, then two of us would turn around and jump on him, and we get him off. But not that it was right or wrong, right, but Solomon makes the point. It's always easier for two to withstand one person. He said, and then he says, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. We know about that with ropes. You know, you have ropes, the more coils you put in them, the easier it is. We used to pull, when I came up, we pulled trucks and things with chains, but now you can hook a rope on it and pull it. We got 3 or 4 cords on it if it's strong enough. So Solomon says, better, then he gets down the next area we move into, he talks about some popularity. Now, all of y'all familiar with popularity, right? I know a lot of you, when you grew up, you just wanted to be popular. Yeah. But nobody wants to be that way today, right? But Solomon says down in verse number 13, better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king who will not be admonished. What does he mean admonished? Who won't listen to instructions. You know, sometimes when we get old, and I had some examples in my life, and I always said, I hope that when I got old, I would never be too old to listen to instruction, just because it came from somebody who was not as old as me. And I've adhered to that too, and found out that if I had not, I would have missed out on a lot of things. But Solomon says, he said, for out of prison he comes to reign, whereas also he that is born in the kingdom becomes poor. And he said, I consider all the living which walked under the sun with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. He said, there's no end of all the people, even to all that have been before them. They also that came after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this is also vanity and vexation of spirit. Now let me tell you what Solomon's talking about there, just in a nutshell, and you go back and read it over in different versions in Greek, etc. I mean, Hebrew and so forth. What Solomon is saying, look, here's a person that's real popular. He's a great ruler. He rules over folks and so forth, and things of this nature. And then what happens is he gets older, and he stopped listening to instructions. And people just soon forget about him. And so somebody comes who used to be in prison can come out and maybe run for a seat of government or something of this nature. He or she becomes real famous. And everybody listens to them. What Solomon basically lets us know in these few verses here is, look, popularity is waning. What I mean by that is popularity now does not always popularity then and forever. You can be popular today and unpopular tomorrow. How long does it take to become unpopular? You figure that one out. Just do the wrong thing, and immediately you get there. So that's where Solomon is in chapter 4. Now, we covered, looked at the vanity of being alone, the value of friends. You ought to be dependent upon friends and family as much as you can, and church members, don't be afraid to do that either. And as I mentioned before, God's plan was not for us to be alone. So we ought to be dependent upon relationships instead of being in isolation more frequently. All right, now we go to chapter 5. Chapter 5. And chapter 5 might get a little dicey for some, but that's okay. We're going to learn some things from the Word of God. Solomon says in chapter 5, he says, we're going to look at the knowledge he gleaned from his search for the purpose of life. We're going to look at the proper way. Somebody need to investigate that noise. We're going to look at the proper way to approach God in worship and the danger of making foolish vows. And we're going to learn to appreciate some limitation riches and see the ability to enjoy them as a gift from God. Now, Notice what Solomon says in chapter 5, verse 1. He said, keep your foot when you go to the house of God. Be more ready to hear than to give sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Now, I want somebody to get me James 1:24, and then somebody else get me John 4:24. And then somebody else get me 1 Timothy 4:16. 1 Timothy 3:15. I'm sorry.
James chapter 1, verse 24.
Read.
For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was.
All right, need to be aware of yourself. And now, James, that's James 1:24. The next one I asked you for what? It's what? 4:24. John. He said, God is the Spirit. Now, notice Solomon said, keep your foot when you go into the house of God, and be more ready. He didn't say just be ready. Be more ready to hear than to give sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Now, I would just go ahead and tell you about the other two, so for the sake of time. There were some men, two boys, Cain and Abel, over in Genesis 4, and around verses 3 through 8. Those boys came before God, more or less the house of God, which would have represented God's house, and they decided to offer God something that he didn't ask for. Folks, when we go in the house of God, we got to do what God expects us to do. We got to display the kind of manners that God expects us to display in his house. I can't come in his house and just curse out whoever I want to curse out. Now, I'm going to tell you, just being inside of this building here does not make you in his house. Amen, somebody. I'm going to deal with that in just a minute. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, I think I said 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. Charles, you got that? If you tarry long, I knew you wouldn't have to turn to it. Read on.
That thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth.
The house of God is the what? The church of the living God. That's God's house. We ought to know how we ought to behave ourselves in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the ground and pillar of the truth. So Solomon said, keep your foot when you go into the house of God. That was true then. That's true now. That's true now. So he said, be more ready to hear. We ought to be ready to hear instructions than to give sacrifice of fools. We just can't come in here and offer God anything we want to offer him. We say, oh, you know what? I got this itch. I need to scratch it in my toe. I'm going to do a little praise dance today. Did you hear that from God? No. Says I'm ready to practice some things that Solomon did he shouldn't have done. I got me 2 concubines. I'm bringing them and a wife today. And I'm going to be in the house of God. No. He's to be ready to hear in the house of God. The house of God is the church. And when you read throughout the New Testament tells you how to behave yourself. It tells us how to behave ourselves in the house of God. So Solomon goes on to say, don't give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider that not that they do evil. He said, do not be rash with your mouth. And don't let your heart be hasty to utter anything before God, for God is where? In heaven, and then upon earth, therefore let your words be few. Have you ever been, you don't have to raise your hand. Have you ever been rash with your mouth before God? Somebody say, I've never been. How many people go, oh, Jesus Christ? Why are you saying that? Here's one that came to save us, And we done turned his name into a curse word, a word of our frustration of expression. Then the other things that people say too. Child, heavens no. Why would you bring heaven into your common conversation like that and make it and minimize the importance of heaven? Heaven is a beautiful place. Yes, ma'am.
And I said, can I help you? And he just looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, I heard you call for Jesus Christ, and I work for him. Can I help you?
Amen.
I tell you what, he might have thought you was crazy, but I bet you he didn't say it no more. Well, see, sometimes people have to be called out. Sometimes they do it because they're ignorant. And some of them do it because they're just foolish, and that's all they know. But Solomon said, don't give sacrifice to fools, for they do evil. Don't be rash with your mouth. Don't be hasty with your heart, that you may utter before, with your words you may utter your heart, or utter before God. And then he says, later in the verse, he says, therefore let your words be many, right? Be few. James said, let every man be swift to speak. He said, quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. My mom used to set me down sometimes and talk to me, and she would point to her mouth. She said, son, I'm going to tell you what, the only thing get you in any real trouble is that little red thing in your mouth. What little red thing? She said, the one you eat with. She said, that tongue. And that thing stuck with me for a long time. I had never read James. But later on, when I became a Christian and I got around to reading James, I said, boy, that lady made good sense. And we would talk about it later on, so when Solomon began to talk about reputation. Our mouth can get us in trouble, not only with men and women, but also with God. Did you hear me? And he said, well, don't nobody know. God always knows. David lets us know that in Psalms when he writes, always know. God always knows. So Solomon goes on to say, don't be rash with your mouth, and don't let your heart be hasty to utter anything before God. And I know that bell going to challenge me in a minute. To utter anything before God. For God is in heaven and you up on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. Listen, all our dreams, just because I dream something and think something is going to happen, I think that's where it's going to happen, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It just means I dreamed it. I don't know about you. I've had some dreams. I'm glad they didn't come true. I was sleeping on my couch one night, and I dreamed a rattlesnake tried to bite me, and I jumped up and kicked, still in my sleep, and kicked the table and messed up my leg, and then so forth. And when I got up, I was glad there was no rattlesnake, but I was sorry that table was there because I was hurt. It took a few days to recover from that. But listen, it's sometimes dreams, we go like, well, you got to, and we tell our kids that, and we mean well. We tell our kids that when they come through school, follow your dreams. I tell you, examine your dreams before you follow your dreams. And just because it's a dream and you dream it does not mean it's always going to be accomplished. God first. And make sure God is always in your dreams. That's the first bell. So let me hasten on here, and I'll stop where I stopped. Solomon mentioned, don't let your mouth lead to the sin. Don't think you can excuse your rash statements and avoid God's anger, the multitude of dreams and many words of vanity, that we ought to fear God. Now listen, when we go down to verse 8, he said, if you see the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, don't be surprised at this. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Now, I probably won't get it further than this, but that's okay. How many of you have heard the statement that everybody works for somebody? Huh?
That's right.
Everybody works for somebody. When I was working with the school system, there were folks that were around, and they would be terrified sometimes of principals. Sometimes you have good principals, but every now and then you get one, and boy, they decided, I'm going to show you how much power I got. And some of it is good, and some of it is not good. And so sometimes they would come down and say, Mr. Smith, I just having problems with this. I said, let me tell you something. If you're justified in what you do, remember this. Everybody works for somebody. But before you go to somebody, unless you go into your union, you need to try to talk with that principal. And if you can't reason with that principal, then you go over his or her head, because he or she works for somebody. And that's the same way it is in government. Everybody works for somebody. You heard of lower court and higher court, Supreme Court, and all this kind of everybody. So Solomon basically lets us know in this text that there's always going to be some. We understand there's always going to be some justice where there's some perversion going on, and that perverting of justice. And he said, "Injustice in a province." He said, "Don't be amazed at this, for he is higher than the highest, regardless those that be higher than they." What are you implying, Solomon? That there's a higher calling. And God is higher than all. Now, there's a place where we passed, and we'll come over it again. It shows that God is going to take care of everybody. And then we move to verse 9. He said, moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, God calls the rain to shine, to fall on the what? Just and the unjust. And guess who benefits from the earth? The king. You benefit from it, and the king benefits from it. Everybody who eats have to eat what comes from the earth. Oh, we pack it up and put it on submarines and take it down in the end, but before it gets no submarines, out on no ships, it comes from the earth. So they benefit from it. So Solomon basically lets us know that that God is the one that is over all. And the next one, I'll get to it when we come back next time, verse 10. I'm going to stop at verse 10 because somebody did hit the bell, but the clock is there. We're going to talk about him loving silver. So y'all go ahead and read that, and you just ask yourself before you come back next week, how much do I love silver? All right? I'm not meddling. I'm just saying go ahead and read it. Class dismissed. Thank you for your time, your participation, and your comments, and your presence.
Being alone and the medical issue of started getting up and getting down, and then the arthritis and sciatica. You must have been reading my medical records.
I read some of that's in mine too. Yeah, so I know a few folks that do.
You forgot verses 4 to 6, the importance of keeping your word.
Oh,
you skipped over that.
You know what? I got lost.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to go back to that.
Yeah, because that's key right there.
Yeah,
especially that story about Jephthah's vow.
And you know, and I have a comment for that too.
Yeah, you forgot verses 4 to 6. I didn't hear a word on that.
And it wasn't on purpose. I missed that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to pick that up. Stop.
Lisa, your mic's on.